Hi everybody, Bryan Ballreich with Roland DGA in Irvine. I am here again to answer another question from the field, and this time we're talking about the General tab within our VersaWorks 6 RIP software. So right off the bat, here we are in a Windows 10 station, and I've got the RIP open, and I've simply double-clicked on the job that's in the queue here, and that brings up our media settings right off the bat. And from there, we simply continue down on the left side. And the next one down is quality. The one below that is levels. The next below that is an EPS control dialog. The one below that is for marks. And the one below that is general. So this is the one that we're going to talk about today. So just want to cover some of the basics. So at the very top, you see cut sheet after output. And simpler than that, it simply will command the printer once it's completed printing to advance a predefined amount, which we'll talk about here in a second, and then it will issue the cut command, and the machine will run the head out and drop the knife and then separate the sheet, allowing it to fall from the printer, and it will set itself up for the next job. So that's all it is, cut sheet after you're done printing. Use custom settings. I'll go ahead and turn that on. And this is simply this amount of space that we add at the end of the print. So very simply, you can click this open and have no space added, or anywhere up to 200 millimeters. And I'll just give you one of my pointers. This is very useful to either conserve media or useful when you're laminating. I particularly like adding quite a bit. If it's the very last print of a roll that I know is bound for the laminator, I'll actually tack on quite a bit of space at the end, because that then becomes my leader as I begin my process of lamination. And that different schools of thought, but frankly, I'd rather have extra material used to become the leader, because I don't know if anyone who's run the laminator knows that the moment you begin to laminate is when you'll typically see if there's some type of setup abnormality that you need to correct for. So you need that leader to give you that grace period to watch and make sure everything on the laminator is looking perfect. And then hopefully you have enough leader to stop what you're doing and reset and still have some space before the actual print. So again, you've had a chance to reset everything. So again, it's just a little tip, but this is very useful to control the space at the end of the print. Another little tip here is I usually use a space of about 30 millimeters, and that is especially true if I'm doing multiple runs of jobs, one behind the other, that are made for print lam cut. It's a nice thing to remember this space, because you can set up for automated cutting. As long as you remember the space value, it will look for that same value and look for the next row to orient to when it does its optical re-registration. So again, if you've got print lam cut, 30 millimeters is just enough white space to clear and let the optical eye see the next row. It's the least amount. If you do it any tighter, it can get confused. So I tend to stick to about 30 when I'm doing a multiple run job that's print lam cut. Overprint, very simply, it's if you have a material that seems to, it's one that you may not have a profile for. It may be a third-party material. A good example might be backlit. Backlit materials, to get that opacity when you lay it up against light to make it not look too washed out, you might want to add a second layer of ink, building it up so that you get 2 hits of ink for every, what would be a 1 hit. You actually are laying a second hit of ink on top of it, or a third. We actually allow you to lay up to 3 passes of ink. Again, this is only when you have those times where you want to take control and lay more ink down, but that's a good example. Is typically a backlit. Moving down, we have media feed controls. So this is really, really important. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about this one in specific, because it relates so much to print quality. I have it right here set for its default, which is to use the default media setting. So let's cover that real quick. Notice if I go back up here and go to quality settings and change the material from generic vinyl. And I'm going to go ahead and move that to a lightweight banner vinyl. Now, typically banner vinyl, any banner material, are typically rather thick. But now you'll notice if I go back down to the General tab, and I notice that if I'm using the default, which is basically saying whatever the profile has commanded within the profile. So whenever they made the profile for that material, for LBV2, they pre-programmed a media feed calculation into it so that when you load the profile, this populates and becomes the correct value for that thickness of material. And the media feed now, as you've noticed, is updated. It's no longer 0. It's jumped up to 0.8%. So I'll give you my rule of thumb. I tend to not use defaults. I tend to change this to printer settings, and I'll explain why. Media feed has everything to do with the thickness of the material. So what we're doing is this is a computation concerning the thickness and the way that we drag material. Because we pinch material using our pinch wheels and drag it through, as the material gains thickness, we have to change the value of how much per pass that we need to advance the material so that that next pass is exactly where it needs to be to make a beautiful print that doesn't have overlapping bands, ones that are laying on top of each other, or worse, ones that are too far apart and actually showing white space between them. This is that control. So by selecting printer settings, this is where to be at a printer, I would use, what I use is actually the print head cleaning test. And I look at the adjoining blocks of color to see what that gap is. And I can make adjustments on the printer very simply through the command structure on the front menu. It's about two clicks away, and you start increasing the value or decreasing the value. And I would print that print several times, always watching for that perfect position where I'm not seeing a white space between the two blocks of color, and I'm not seeing an overlap where they're laying on top of each other, creating a dark line. So that is my way of doing it. The main reason, it's not just the fact that the material is thicker, it can have everything to do with how well the material is traveling through the printer. This may sound crazy, but different materials drag differently. In this case, we're talking about a banner material. I know for a fact that it has a somewhat of a rough backside. It's not a smooth paper finish like a lot of materials are. And when that comes in contact with the machine on its way in, it can actually drag quite a bit. And worse yet, sometimes you can't rely on the preset value. You literally have to test that material to know its feed characteristics. You have to test it every roll. And this is what I do. When I print, I will take a roll, and when I load it, I will run through that process. It doesn't take long. It only takes about a minute. And you're checking that media feed cal to literally get the correct value for this instance. And it's critical. Once you've got a media feed set, you're now getting bands showing up exactly where they should be. And that is just that critical for a good looking print. So again, your options here, the default, which will take into account the one that's pre-programmed, or if you choose, you could put in a custom value here that you just know. If by memory I know this material and I prefer it to be having a feed cal of this, and you feel comfortable doing that, enter it here. Alternatively, you use the printer settings, and that's my personal favorite. Moving on. Other controls. So we're going to fly this open and we're going to take a look at custom controls. So right off the bat, we've got vacuum power. And this strictly is the machine bed has a several fans that are operating as a slight suction to the bed itself, so that as material comes through, the vacuums create a pull, a suction underneath the material to help keep it flat as it's being fed through the machine, and we're printing on it. We can control that with either a strong or a normal amount. That's all it is. It's a variance of vacuum power. If you're having trouble, if you're seeing that a material is rather flimsy, a lot of materials in the industry, they try to cut costs and they are very thin and they're not very rigid. the best feeding materials will always be the ones that are more rigid. They hold their own shape as they're being pinched and being pushed and pulled through a machine. If they have their own strength and torsion to hold their shape and to stay flat, they're always going to feed better. The least fun ones to work with are the really thin ones, because they don't want to lay flat. They're flimsy. You push and pull and they start to change, and they may cockle and ride up and create buckling. So to counteract that, you could try changing your vacuum strength. This is that control, so simply normal or strong. Be careful. Sometimes if you have the vacuum set too high, it tends to start dragging. You're literally holding the material and preventing it from being moved, so just be careful with that. Dry time, just as it sounds. You've done a print job and you know for a fact that this particular material takes additional time for it to cure. Even though our inks are really good and they do dry quickly on a variety of material, there are going to be times where you run into something that isn't expected and you have to take control over. Well, you have this option. We can just simply add time, dwell time. So it's literally the print's done, and now it's simply going to let it sit right on top of the heating elements that are built into the machine. So you can just give it a minute, a 3-minute span, a 5-minute span. And I typically have used this specifically when a material's, a good example, the BG's, the BG2 series has a white ink option. So white ink on several materials tends to dry slower. So I'll pre-program this, and I'll usually add anywhere, like usually a 3-minute span is plenty. Sometimes it's just a minute. Those are the most common ones I use. It's just adding a little bit of dry time. So before it rewinds to do cutting, let's say, we've given it plenty of time to set up. And the last one here, head height. I always set this honestly at the printer end. And to be honest, that's your safest bet. It's always good to physically do a check. I'm notorious for that in the office. I tend to be very particular about how I run the machines, but I am constantly doing a hands-on analysis of the media feed, the head height, to get the best results. It's the only way that I know of that you can be precise. So physically going to the machine and setting the head there is my preferred method. If you choose to, you could command the machine through this to set for a height. However, just so you know, it is a manual operation. So whatever I set here, let's say if I set it for high, so I'll change this and I'll go to high, and I send this job, and the machine happens to be at a low head height, it'll simply beep and ask for your help, and it'll say, please move head to position high, and then it will continue the job. Again, my personal favorite, or how I prefer to run the printing shop, is I keep these both at printer settings. Again, I just feel better about controlling it at the printer end. It's that way I'm confident. I've taken control over this project from the beginning. I know how the machine is set up, so I feel confident that whatever I do here at the software, I don't have to worry about those anymore. And the last tidbit here is the heater controls. Again, we could just say default, and you'll notice that LBV, which is the material I had selected, has some preset print heat and dry heat. So the print heat is the heater that occurs underneath where the actual print heads travel. Then the one further out towards the front of the machine and heading down as the material hangs out the front, there's another heater, that is the dryer. So you can take control of these if you choose to. Again, I tend to use printer settings, and again, same reason going back to my other reasoning with the others. I just feel more confident setting a machine up at the machine end, and then knowing I'll just focus on software tasks like loading the job, sizing it, setting it up for output, but all the hardware has really been handled by me before the process here starts. So, well, that is the general tab. I hope this has been helpful, and I look forward to seeing you again in another video. Thank you.